It is my honour and pleasure to introduce our speakers for the annual Lionel Sharpe Memorial presentation. We'd like to, I can't see everyone who's here, but I believe Anita Sharpe, Lionel's wife, is here, and Natalie Miller, his daughter, and we extend a special welcome to any other family members that are online with us. Lionel was involved in the establishment of the Society from its very beginning. He held numerous roles on the committee and was editor of our newsletter Jewish Genealogy Down Under for 15 years. He produced a database of 12,000 Jewish refugees that migrated to Australia, and also joined a project with Ephraim Finch at the Melbourne Hebra Kadisha, documenting and photographing gravestones at various Jewish cemeteries, a project that still continues today. When the program Who Do You Think You Are did an episode on Ita Buttrose, their research into Ita's Jewish ancestry was done by Lionel, and he made a memorable appearance on the show. For services to the Jewish community, he was awarded an OAM in 2009, and following his passing in 2019, the Society felt it fitting that we recognise his enormous contribution to the Society by naming the presentation at the AGM in his honour. The title of tonight's presentation is Identifying a Kindertransport's Child's Parents, and is the outcome of separate but connected efforts of our two presenters tonight, Dr. Paul Gardner and Michael Tobias. Paul has a science degree and a master's degree in education from the University of Melbourne and a PhD in education from Monash University. He retired from Monash in 2002 from his position as Reader in Education after publishing extensively in the fields of science education and psychological measurement. He also has a long history of involvement in Jewish community life, mostly through his chairmanship of the B'nai B'rith Anti-Defamation Commission. In 2014, he became very interested in genealogy, focusing mostly but not exclusively on his late mother's family history. In the past 6 years, he has had several articles published in American and British genealogy journals, presented a paper at an AJGS international conference in Florida, and written a book about his mother's cousin who was active in the anti-Nazi resistance in Amsterdam. A week ago, the Australian Jewish Historical Society Journal published an article relating to family members who arrived in Melbourne in the early Victorian colonial days of the 1850s. In 2008, he was awarded an AM, Member of the Order of Australia, in the Australia National Honours List for his work in combating racism and promoting interfaith relations. Paul's late mother's maiden name was Badrian, which was also the surname of the child in the title of tonight's presentation. Without that tiny fact, none of the research that led to tonight's event would ever have happened. His co-presenter is Michael Tobias, who's a well-known figure in the Jewish community in Glasgow, Scotland, where he lives, but he's also known internationally for his expertise in the fields of genealogy and Jewish history. He has an honours degree in mathematics and physics from the University of Glasgow and a master's degree in genealogy from the University of Strathclyde. I love saying that. In 1995, he was co-founder of Jewish Records Indexing Poland. And since 2022, he's the president of the Jewish Genealogical Society of Great Britain. His involvement in this organisation was significant in the context of tonight's Zoom presentation, as it was Paul Gardner's article published in the Society's journal Shemot that laid the foundation for Michael's significant contribution to tonight's topic. As an early example of Michael's genealogical work carried out when he was Vice President of Jewish Gen, he combined with others to bring about the reunion of two Holocaust survivors, one in Glasgow, the other in Israel, who had last seen each other in 1940 and joyously reunited for the first time 67 years later. Michael wrote about it in an article called Moniek and Moshe. More recently, Michael, as principal investigator for a project sponsored by the International Institute for Jewish Genealogy, has been engaged in a detailed demographic study of the Scottish Jewish community from the founding of the community to the present. As you will soon discover when you hear him speak, he's well qualified to do this, the third generation Scottish Jew. We don't hear too many of them in Australia. For his work in these fields, he was given national recognition in Great Britain by the Queen in 2020 with the award of an OBE, the Officer of the British Empire. So, without further ado, please welcome to deliver the Lionel Sharpe Memorial presentation, first Dr. Paul Gardner, followed by Michael Tobias.
Now let's go to slideshow. Yeah. I've got slideshow.
Yeah, that's it. Right, yeah.
I can't find, hang on, I can't see. Where does it say from the current slide?
There.
There.
Yeah.
Okay.
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 Now, can we also see the
You're
other?
right. On you
Yeah.
go.
Can't see any people.
Helen,
No, you
share the
can't.
screen.
Just talk.
Helen,
Sorry?
share the screen.
Share the
I
screen.
did share the screen.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm going to have to get out of this in order to share screen.
Yeah.
I did share screen.
Well, maybe. All right. Now.
Share screen. So I have to say this one. Ah, hang on.
Share.
No, here, this one.
Yeah.
I've got to get the cursor to here. Hang on a minute. I can't get the... Sorry, folks, I just need to get the cursor in the right place. I have two screens and it doesn't always like shifting between them. That's it. Can you see that now?
Yeah, start the slideshow and the first
Okay.
one will come up.
Yeah. From the beginning.
From the beginning.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, first of all, before I actually begin saying anything of importance about the topic, I think there are two people that we should be welcoming very specially, because it's really making this, for me, a very important occasion. I see the names Rob and Claire on one of the screens. I can't see them at the moment, but the two people who are sitting there, Claire Gamston and her father, the Reverend Courtney Harris. And he is the central character in tonight's story. I haven't seen them in person since 2015. We've corresponded a lot with Claire in the years that have gone by, but I haven't been face to face with her father since 2015 when we met in Amsterdam for a day. And I'm absolutely delighted that they're able to tune in to this presentation this evening. With that said, let me get on to the actual topic. Identifying a kinder transport boy's parents. Okay, who is this boy? Well, he was born in 1934 in Boyton, which happens to be also my late mother's hometown. Boyton's in Upper Silesia in Germany, not too far from Poland. And a baby was born in that town to a woman called Frida Badrian. And the name of the boy was Kurt Walter Badrian. The father's name of Kurt Walter is not listed on the birth record. Frida was unable to care for him and placed him in an orphanage run by a Christian organisation, a Lutheran organisation in one of the suburbs of Boyton. In 1939, the World War had not yet quite begun, but by that stage, the loving and caring director of the orphanage decided that this was no place for a Jewish boy and arranged to place him on a kinder transport to England. Kinder transport, many of you will know what that means, but it was a program developed by Sir Nicholas Winton in England to bring people from young children from various parts of Europe and save them as a result. Kurt was put on a boat to England and he had never heard from his mother again. And as you can see from tonight's visitors, he's still alive, aged 89, and he lives in England, but his name's not Kurt Walter Badrian anymore. I'll explain that in a minute, but his name is now Courtney Harris. And this is the story tonight of how we discovered his family history, the we being Michael Tobias and myself, with help from a lot of different people.
I'll come and do it. I don't like to it.
Right. Right. Okay. To give you an overview of the timeline for this, it's gone on for many years. I don't know when the Harris family actually began to try to discover Courtney's family history. It goes back to at least 1990, but I'm fairly sure that even as a child, as a young adult, Courtney would have been wondering who his mother was. So that's been a search that's gone on throughout his life. but I know they made serious attempts in the 1990s, because that's when the internet began to appear and it was possible to make connections with other people. I didn't find out about the existence of the Harris family until 2014, the same year that I began my serious genealogical research. A year later, and at that stage I didn't know anything much more about it than that, but we did meet Courtney and his daughter and son-in-law Rob in Amsterdam. Why we were meeting in Amsterdam is a whole story in itself, and I'm not going to go into that. You might want to ask a question about it later, but it's not absolutely central to what I'm talking about this evening. I carried on the research for 6 years, and we'll see what the results of that were as I developed this talk. But then afterwards, in 2021, Michael Tobias came in, or earlier than that, but it was in the last 3 years that Michael has become involved with this project as well. And he will, of course, tell you in more detail his contribution to it. I mentioned that Kurt Walter Badrian was born in 1934. He was born on the 5th of May. The birth record is dated almost a week later. It took 6 days for the mother to record the birth. Often births are recorded a day or two later, usually by somebody in the family, but she obviously had nobody else to do the recording of the birth, so that took several days. The birth record of Kurt Walter Badrian, I have a copy of it, and she's described as unverehelichten, which means unmarried. She's ohne Beruf, which is unemployed, and the address from which she was living was Humboldtstraße number 13 Humboldt Street in Beuthen. Here's a lovely picture of Kurt Walter as he was aged about 5, and that was taken at the Diakonhaus Friedenshort orphanage. And thank you for the Harris family for that particular photo. Another photo of him appears on the visa application, or not the visa application, sorry, the Kindertransport document that permitted him entrance without a visa, no visa necessary, into England in 1939. And here's a picture of Kurt Walter as he was when we met in Amsterdam in 2015. He's no longer Kurt Walter Badrian. He's now the Reverend Courtney Harris. Courtney is, of course, an anglicised version of his original name, Kurt, and the Harris name is the surname of a Christian family who lovingly adopted him and cared for him and brought him up and made him the man who he is today. And the title Reverend reflects his work as a minister of a Protestant church. Not the normal work for a Jewish boy, but it's one of the unusual aspects of this particular story. Here's a brief overview of what I'll be talking about. Firstly, the early attempts by the Harris family to discover Courtney's history, then the issue of identifying his mother, and then finally a summary of that. Let me begin then with the early attempts. The address was known to the family. They had the address on the birth record, and I obtained the address also from Beuthen town records. And you can see in the 1934 record, Frida Badrian is listed there. OB, ohne Beruf, without employment, and the address Humboldtstraße 13 is listed in the 1934 entry. I also obtained a copy of the 1937 entry, and she's not listed there anymore. So whatever happened between 1934 and 1937 was in the early days simply unknown. She's simply not there anymore after that 1934 address. I won't go into detail, but I want to mention at least a couple of issues which we can learn something from in looking at these two address things. Firstly, it happens that 2 names above Frida is Emma Badrian, and she's described as a Witwe, a widow, living at Dingosstrasse 35. Well, this one happens to be of particular interest to me because that's my late grandmother, Emma Badrian. She married my grandfather and she was living in the same town. You've also noticed that she's not living at the same address. Emma is now, in 1937, no longer described as a witwe, but a Ventmelin, a pensioner, living in a different address, Katowice Strasse, number 12. And if you look at the addresses, many of the people there are not living at the same address. And there's a Nazi story behind this about people being emptied out of the homes that they lived in and being forced to live in much smaller and cheaper addresses somewhere else. Also, people who had jobs have lost those jobs. You can see Herman down here. Herman was my uncle, my great uncle. Schneiderei Inhalter, it says there. That means owner of a tailor's business. In 1937, he's no longer the owner of the tailor's business. He's simply described as a Schneider, and he's living at a different address. That is because he lost his job, employed by a non-Jewish, or lost the job because the business was taken over by the Nazis, and so forced to work without owning a business anymore. I mention all this in passing, but I think it helps to have the background of what life was like during the Nazi period during those years. But why did I get involved, and how did I get involved? Well, it's a very simple answer. In 2014, I was doing research on my Badrian family, and I was looking for information anywhere I could, and I used the web. And one of the things I found on the web was a search in Family Finder by a woman called Claire van Claveren Gamston, and it told me to click here if I wanted to contact her because she was wanting information about Badrians anywhere in Germany. I did click there, and I made contact with Claire van Claveren Gamston, and Claire is Courtney's daughter, and that's the real start of tonight's story. That's when I began to become involved in it. It's a complicated story. I call it jigsaw puzzles, mazes, and up and down the garden path. And the problem is that there are many women called Frida Badrian. I had a great aunt called Frida Badrian, for that matter, but she was far too old to be Kurt's mother, so I can rule her out pretty quickly. But there are quite a few Frida Badrians of the right age, and trying to find out what happened to them and whether they might have been or could not have been Courtney's mother, that was a complicated issue. I'm going to start with a story that I got from the Harris family. The story came from a woman called Irma Spitz. Her maiden name was Badrian, Irma Badrian, which is the namesake of my mother. But I can assure you my mother had nothing to do with this story. Irma Spitz lived in Peru. She left for Peru before the war, and she had a story which she was able to pass on to Courtney Harris and the family about a possible mother who the Frida was. And that's, I'll come to that in a moment. There are others involved in presenting stories. Eric Badrian's another, and the German government had an idea as well. And I'll tackle them, and we'll deal with them as we go through. Let's start with Irma Spitz's story. Irma Spitz knew that she had a cousin called Frida Badrian who married, and this Frida Badrian lived in Boyton at the time, and Irma knew that Frida had separated and possibly divorced from her husband. Her married name was Rosenbaum, Frida Rosenbaum, but her maiden name was Badrian. And she had the idea that maybe the divorced or separated Frida had had an affair with somebody, got pregnant, and she was the mother of Courtney, of Kurt. Well, it's plausible, the idea of a separated, divorced woman having a child. That's certainly plausible, possible. And I took all the details of this and I started writing it up in 2016. But I have to say I wasn't convinced. And the more I looked at it, the more unconvinced I became. Yes, Frida Rosenbaum did live in Boynton, and she was a Holocaust victim. But when I looked at the details, it just didn't make sense to me. For a start, she had a son already in 1927, and they were living together. And it just, to me, if a woman is married and even separated and divorced, and has a son who's actually living together with her, and later on they perished together as Holocaust victims, it makes no sense to me that this woman would give up her married name. The son is called Werner Rosenbaum. Why would she call herself Frida Badrian? So I didn't really think much of that story, and I just wanted to keep looking, and that's what I did. As far as we can tell, the Rosenbaum pair both perished. They were ausgesiedelt, to use a beautiful Nazi euphemism. Ausgesiedelt means relocated, or it means deported. It actually means deported to be sent to their deaths. And they were the two, Elfrida and her son Werner, were both deported, and they left in 1942 and died as a result of that. Her husband Eric was no longer living in Boynton. He was in Breslau. He was deported from Breslau, but at a different time. And so as far as I'm concerned, they have nothing to do with this story other than being plausible for a time as being possibly Frida possibly being the mother. Okay, we have another story, which is much a side issue because it's not about the mother so much as maybe about the father. I mean, it's a whimsical story. It's about Eric Badrian, who was an older brother of Irma Spitz. Now, if you really noticed before the list of people living in Boynton, you might have noticed Eric's name was there. His name is listed there. He was a young engineer living in Boynton before the war. He found work as a marine engineer, got on a ship, and eventually went to what would become Israel before the war. And he had a brother called Adolf who left Germany before the war, emigrated to Palestine to be with his brother. And Adolf made a huge number of submissions to Yad Vashem about relatives who perished in the Holocaust. Adolf went on to Germany, back to Germany a few years afterwards, and died there. The point of this story is that when in sometime in the 1990s, Courtney went to Israel to meet Eric. Eric took one look at Courtney and told him, "You look just like Adolf." Now you can make your own interpretations of that. But I have to say, I saw the photograph that I showed you earlier of Courtney as a 5-year-old, and I could say he looked a bit like me as well. Maybe there's just a very strong Badrian gene that runs through lots of people. But anyway, I don't place any value on this particular story at all. I'm just passing it on. It came from the family. There was another possibility, Frida Badrian, maiden name Brenitzer. I hadn't heard of this at the time of the Harris search, and the idea was not passed on to me, but I did encounter this particular name during my search for every known Frida Badrian that I could encounter. I didn't think of her as a likely prospect. She lived in Breslau. She later moved to Berlin. She married an Adolf Badrian, not that same one, a different one. I can tell you there are tons of them. There are about 15 Adolf Badrians in the records. But there wasn't a single connection that I could find with Boynton. And although this suggestion had come from a German government official as a possible person to be Courtney's mother, I didn't think much of that one. So what's the answer? Well, I'm going to give you the answer that I came to and then tell you the evidence for it later on. But basically, the answer that I got to was after excluding every single other case that I could find of every possible Frida Badrian that I came across. And here's the answer that I came across. And that is a Frida Badrian who was the daughter of Leopold and Lucy Badrian, who are on my family tree. And they're on my family tree as very distant relatives. descendant of Abraham Badrian, who's the older brother of my great-great-great-grandfather, Joseph Badrian. Leopold and Lucy died in the early 1930s, so they were never aware. They couldn't be aware of the birth of their grandson Kurt. Here's the birth record of Frida and her parentage in the Boyton records. She was born in Boyton on the 11th of January 1904. But why this one, and what's the evidence that I have? Well, as I say, it's the only person that I could come across in all of my 6 years of work on it that fitted the various qualifications that I was looking for. But why this one? All right, let's have a look at the details. Well, firstly, let me tell you her family background. As I said, she's a descendant of my great-great-grandfather's brother, Abraham. Here's the line, and you can see an enormous number of grandchildren here, 13 of them through the parentage of Mendel Badrian, who's the son of Abraham. Mendel gets the gold medal in the Badrian Olympics for fertility. He had 13 children, nearly all of whom survived. And that's the line down from Abraham through Mendel to Jonas to Leopold and to Frida. And that's just a summary of that. But what's the evidence? The evidence comes from Hungary. It didn't all come at once. It took about a year to assemble it. And the first evidence was only partial. It was of a woman, Friederike Badrian. And the information had that she was born in a town called, spelt in Hungarian, B-O-J-T-E, pronounced in Hungary, Bojta. I thought, well, maybe that's a town in Hungary. Maybe she's a Hungarian Jewish woman. And I looked up, I should add, geography was never my strongest subject at school, but I looked up all the places in Hungary that I could find and found no record of any place called Bojta, B-O-Y-T-E. Later on, another record, this one down at the bottom of my screen, says Bojten, B-O-J-T-E-N, and then it hit me, well, that probably refers to Boyton. It's just been recorded in Hungarian spelling, but it's the sounding is exactly the same as the German B-E-U-T-H-E-N, which is pronounced in German Boyton. But what put it all together, that this was no Hungarian woman, this was a woman born in Germany, was this top one, which said who her parents were. It says, Badrian Lipot and Dara Luri. Now, Lipot is the Hungarian name for Leopold, and Dara was the maiden name. Luri is a misspelling. It was Lucy, or it's a mistranscription of this handwriting. But Lucy, Dara, and Leopold Badrian are on my family tree, and that's what allowed me to connect them with my family tree. And I settled on this one with simply on the basis that this was the only person that I could find that fitted all of the requirements of being in Boyton at the right time, not being married. And all we could tell, if we accept this as being the right answer, was at least the comforting thought that she was not a Holocaust victim. She died in the hospital in Hungary, sadly from a infection, a bacterial infection. No control of it was possible in those days. It was before the days of penicillin. And so she passed away in a Jewish hospital, cared for, a sad ending, but not the ending of a calamitous death in the Holocaust. But that was the story that I was able to put together. And that's where it was in 2021, at which point we pass to the next person who will carry this story on and tell us the next level.
You have to
Stop share?
Yes, you have to stop share.
Michael?
Mute.
Okay, can you see and hear?
Yeah,
everything here?
all good.
Yeah.
Good, Michael.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me to talk tonight, or this morning for me. I'd also like to give a shout out to Ruth and Sandra, who I believe are listening and watching tonight. I was involved in another DNA project with them in 2020. No time just now to give the full story, but just a very, very brief summary. I was asked by somebody in the UK who was adopted to help identify their birth father. A DNA test showed they were 50% Ashkenazi Jewish. And after going through the USA, Australia, Poland, Belgium, and all parts of the UK, I eventually discovered that the woman had 4 half-siblings. In total, there were 5 half-siblings from 4 different mothers. Sandra is one of the half-siblings, and she's visiting Ruth, who's our second cousin in Australia. And then just earlier this year, we discovered a 6th half-sibling from the same Jewish-Polish soldier who was stationed in the UK during the war. So that's a story for another time. But let's now continue with the story of Courtney Kurt's parentage. I was actually brought into this story by Courtney's son Mark. I believe the family had been in touch with one of the companies who do research for one of the DNA TV programs, and they said they couldn't help but suggested I possibly could. And so we immediately began doing DNA tests. So I started in April 2021. And I knew that the theory at that time, and it was probably correct, was that Courtney's grandparents here were Leopold and Lucy. And in fact, I knew the family had visited Boyton at some point in the past, and there's a photograph of Courtney standing in front of the grave of who he thought might be his grandparents. And of course, we later found out, yes, they were. When we started doing the DNA, of course, at that point, I didn't know whether the DNA matches I was getting were on his mother's side or his father's side. I'm going to concentrate on the mother's side and then move on to the father's side with hindsight. This is what I discovered. And one of the best matches at the time was with a K holocheck, 319 centimorgans. That's just a measure of how much DNA you share with the person. I didn't know much about Kay Holochek. I knew she was born in 1980. I discovered from her that her father was born in 1939. So her father was probably the same generation as Courtney. And Kay Holochek was 27% Ashkenazi Jewish. And these were the possibilities from the DNA Painter website of what this 319 centimorgans might mean. And given that I believed there was 1 generation difference, I thought it was probably half first cousin once removed, or more likely a first cousin once removed. So at the moment, I'm thinking first cousin once removed. I suspect that Kay Holochek's father was a first cousin or a half first cousin of Courtney. And here's a photograph of Theodore. Now I couldn't get in touch with Theodore right away. Kay Holochek was in Texas. She told me that her father had remarried and was living in Colombia, in Bogota, Colombia, with his second family. And I tried for a couple of months to get in touch with Theodore, but unfortunately, I then discovered he had some illness. He had a stroke. I waited a few weeks to see if I could contact him after his recovery. But sadly, he then had a massive stroke and he passed away. So we never ever did manage to contact Theodore. So what I then looked at was I looked at the family tree of Leopold and Lucy, and began to look at their descendants to see if I could find somebody who I could do a DNA test with to see if they were connected to Courtney. So here we have a daughter, Ruth Badrian, born 1901, and she had a son. She married and she had a son, Rudolf Goldberg, and I knew there was a great-grandson of Leopold and Lucy called A. Goldberg, born 1961 in Birmingham in England. And the families were in touch. We knew exactly where A. Goldberg was, and so I asked A. Goldberg to take a DNA test. And here are his results, and Courtney and Mr. Goldberg matched by 344 centimorgans. And looking at the possible relationships, again, the obvious one, given that A. Goldberg's father was probably the same generation as Courtney, probably first cousin once removed. So it's likely that Rudolf Goldberg, or Rudy as he was known, was probably a first cousin. And that does suggest indeed that Frida Badrian must have been a sister of Ruth Badrian. I think it's fairly conclusive from the DNA that we do indeed have the correct family. If there'd been a connection at a higher level and then going wider and then back down again the tree, the amount of DNA shared would have been much, much less. It would not be as high as this. And so that is the proof of that. I also had a look at other members of the family descended from Leopold, and we had been in touch with a great grandson, a great-great-grandson, T. Raviv, born in 1979 in Ashkelon in Israel. Now, I didn't do a DNA test with him, but he had a very interesting telephone address book that belonged to his grandfather, and he sent us a copy of one of the pages. And here is the page he sent. And what was interesting to me were the names on the sheet of paper. We had Rudy Goldberg, which is not a surprise. Here's Rudy, second on the list. But top of the list, we had Anneliese, and that looks like Holacek. So surely this is the way that the Holaceks are connected. But who is Anneliese Holacek? And she's living in Bremen. So it's not spelt quite the same way, but surely this is the same family as Kay Holacek, the DNA match from Texas. Doing some research online, I found this burial in Bremen of August Holacek and his wife, Anneliese, born Badrian. So Anneliese Holacek was another Badrian, and she passed away in 2002. Now, this couple did not appear on any of the trees. They weren't on Paul's tree of the Badrians. So I suspected Anneliese was yet another daughter of Leopold, but we had absolutely no proof of that. Also online, it's wonderful what Google can do for you. I found information about Anneliese's death in 2002, and here it says Anneliese Badrian, born Badrian, Holacek Badrian, born 1915, died 2002, and it talks about her children, Theodore Holacek, well, that's the man in Colombia, and then Lucy Colliger, this is a daughter, and Paul Holacek, a son, and surprise, surprise, we have Rudy Goldberg also getting a mention because he's a cousin, and they're living in Bremen. So this looks like Theodore Holacek was indeed a son of Anneliese Badrian, and that is why Theodore would have turned up as a first cousin using DNA. Paul then found this information from a contact in Germany, and this was a registration card of the Holacek family returning from Colombia back to Germany. And here we have August Albert Holacek and his wife, Anneliese Holacek, born Badrian. And it tells us that they came back from Bogota. It gives Anneliese's parents down here as Leopold and Lucy Dura. So there's absolutely no doubt. And we see that the family had married in 1937 in Bogota. And when they returned to Germany, they came back with two of their children, Lucy Holacek and Paul Joseph Holacek, who were born in the 1940s in Bogota. But Theodore, their son, did not return at that time. He decided to stay in Colombia and never returned to Germany. So this all ties in beautifully and confirms that Anneliese was indeed another daughter of Leopold and Lucy, and she was a sister of Frida, an aunt of Courtney. And there's blown up so you can read it a little bit better. There's the parents, Leopold and Lucy, and the children who returned with them from Bogota. Doing some more research, I discovered that sadly Paul Holacek had passed away in 2020, but there's this information about his funeral, which again mentions his sister and his nieces and nephews. And using that information, I used Facebook, which is a useful tool for locating living family. And I eventually found the family in Bremen. So Kurt has a living first cousin, Lucy, and I believe the family have been in touch. So that's the part which proved beyond doubt the connection and who exactly Frida was. We now know precisely which Frida Badrian was the mother. Now going to the father's side, the highest DNA match we had was a superb match of 611 centimorgans, which is really good for a D. Elter, born 1961, father born 1928. So again, I'm believing that D. Elter is probably one generation removed from Courtney. Now, D. Elter is a dentist living in Israel, but he was born in Liverpool in the UK. Now, the relationships that could come from 611 centimorgans are, again, first cousin once removed. If we're looking for something with just a one generation difference, there's not a lot in here. There's a 72% chance of first cousin once removed. The only other one generation gap is a possible half nephew, half uncle, but I doubted that very much. So again, for the moment, I'm going to assume that it's probably first cousin once removed until proven otherwise. Now, what did I find out from D. Elter? I spoke to him in Israel and discovered that his mother's family had been in England for many generations. So the link must be on his father's side. And his father, Ferdinand Elter, was born in Vienna in 1928. And here is Ferdinand's birth certificate from Vienna. And what does it tell us? Here's Ferdinand, 1928. It gives the names of his parents. His father was David Elter, born 1891 in a town called AJGSVic. I apologize for my pronunciation. And his grandparents were Israel Moses Elter and Reisel Elka. And his mother was Hendla Elter. That's a bit strange. They both seem to have an Elter surname. And D. Elter confirmed his grandparents were first cousins, which confuses matters a little because it means that the amount of DNA shared will have been boosted by the fact that the grandparents were first cousins. Now, Hendla Elter was born in 1896 in a town called Chazanov, and she was the daughter of Judah Lieb Ulreich and Brucha Elter. Now, this is a bit strange. Why is she called Elter when her father was called Lieb Ulreich? And this is because Chazanov was in Galicia, what's known as Galicia. It's now a town in Poland. Now, if anyone of you have done research of Jewish families in Galicia, you'll know it gets very complicated because most of the Jewish families would have had marriages in synagogues. The whole congregation would accept that, the rabbis would accept it, but the state authorities did not accept it, and they would not recognize the marriage unless the couple also had a civil registration, which cost money. Most families didn't bother. But it did mean when they came to register their children, the state did not recognize those children as being legitimate. All children were deemed illegitimate and technically should be registered under the mother's maiden name. And that's why Hendla Elter was registered under her mother Brucha Elter's maiden name. Now, in some towns, the clerks of the court understood exactly who was the father, who was the mother. They would sometimes list the father, sometimes not list the father. Some children were sometimes registered under the father's name and some children under the mother's name. And if they were being very strict, it may be that the mother's parents also had no civil marriage. And so the surname on the birth record might actually be the maternal grandmother's surname. So this makes our task of doing research in Galicia a little difficult, but a bit of a challenge and quite interesting. Now here is information from the marriage record in Vienna. D. Elter's grandparents got married in Vienna in 1920. And here we have the groom, David Elter. And again, born in Krzeszowicz, but he's living in Chazanov. So that's probably how he met his wife. Again, he's a son of Israel Moses Elter and Reisel Elka. And then for the bride, we have Hendla Elter, born in Chazanov, daughter of Judah Lieb Ulreich and Brucha Elter. Now, I did have a look at the records for Chazanov. Because of my involvement in Jewish Records Index in Poland, I do have access to a lot of records, but sadly, the records of Chazanov are very incomplete. There are very few records that survive, and so it wasn't going to be possible to build much of a family tree. Just out of interest, here's a map showing the locations of the different towns. Up here we have Bytom. The purple line is the old border between Prussia and Galicia. And you can see that just over the border we have Chrzanów, which is where one of the families came from, and AJGSVic, which is further east. And so those are the towns listed on the marriage and birth records in Vienna. So it's not very far from Chrzanów to Bytom. It's around 25 miles. But looking at information I had available, many families living on one side of the border did indeed travel backwards and forwards over the border for work, and they met other families on the other sides of the border, and there was intermarriage. So it's not beyond the bounds of possibility that the families we're looking at now are definitely connected. The DNA shows there's some connection, but can we discover exactly what the connection is? I looked up the Jewish Gen communities database to get more information about the towns, and here you can see that Chrzanów before the war was in Galicia, it was in the Austrian Empire, and then between the wars it was part of Poland and is in Poland today. Bytom, part of Silesia in Prussia, but now is called Bytom in Poland. I then looked at other DNA matches to see if I could find any other matches for Courtney, and one which popped up, which wasn't particularly good, it's only 120 centimorgans, which is not fantastic, was a man called Leo Stashover, born in 1922. And you can see from the possible relationships where we're going back much, much further now to second, third, even fourth cousins or even more. So it was going to be very difficult to find out how this relationship worked. However, I was interested in this case. This was on a another website called GEDmatch, where people can upload their DNA results and compare with other people. I recognized the person who had uploaded this DNA. It was somebody I worked with in JRI Poland called Judy Golan. And I asked Judy, could you please send me the family tree of your father, Leo Stashover? And she sent me this bit of the tree. And the interesting thing was that Leo's father, Wolf Stashover, was born in Chrzanów. So we now have a DNA match with somebody else from the same town. Not only that, but Lewis's mother, Miriam, her maiden name was Ulrich. So now we have Ulrichs again connected to Courtney. And given that we know from the Vienna records that one of the grandparents was an Ulrich, I'm now suspecting the connection is not with the Elter family, but probably with the Ulrich family. Also, just another mention, which I'll come back to later, Miriam's mother's maiden name was Groner. And I took a note of all these names because we were dealing in Galicia, and therefore any records I did find would probably have the mother's maiden name used rather than the father's name in any birth records. I looked up the Jewish Gen Family Finder, which is the same that Paul did when he was researching the Badrians. And I found at the time when I actually did this, there was only one result. There are now two, but I found somebody else, researcher number 390976, no name or anything, but researching Ulrich in Chrzanów. And I contacted that researcher, and they had a family tree they sent me. But again, because of the lack of documents, the lack of records from Chrzanów, I couldn't link their tree to Judy Golan's tree or to Courtney in any way, but I was beginning to piece together a very large Ulrich family in Chrzanów. So I then thought to myself, well, we're looking for an unknown biological father. Can I find any male Ulrich from one of these trees who's still living, and I could test his Y chromosome, which is passed on from father to son to son to son. If I could find a male Ulrich and test the Y DNA, it would prove whether I was looking in the right family. And I did find a Sid Ulrich, S. Ulrich, born 1944 in the USA. It took me several months of phone calls to convince him to take the DNA test, but he eventually agreed. Now, this is his autosomal test. This is the test which tests all branches of the family. and it's not a great connection, 77 centimorgans. It's quite distant. These are the results we got back first. We then got back the Y DNA results, and I tested 37 markers, as they're called. These are markers which are known to be passed on from father to son, and they're reasonably stable. And S. Ulrich and Courtney matched 33 out of 37, which is not fantastic, but it's not bad. It does mean there is a connection somewhere along the male line. So I was quite confident at this point that yes, we did have an Ulrich family connection, and the father was almost certainly an Ulrich or a descendant of Ulrich, remembering that the surnames may be changing because of non-civil marriages. Some people would suggest that if we're going back 4 or 5 generations for the link, that a 4-step gap in the Y DNA is maybe a little bit too high. But in some families, the Y chromosome is absolutely stable generation after generation after generation. In other families, it does mutate quite regularly. In fact, Bennett Greenspan, who was the founder of Family Tree DNA, the very first company to offer DNA tests to the general public, and the only company offering Y DNA tests, in Bennett's family, he and his brother have a genetic distance of 1. They have a mutation, and one of Bennett's sons has another mutation. So in some families, it is indeed true that every generation there is a mutation. So I wasn't too surprised about a 4-step difference here. At this point, I also managed to get D. Elter's cousin, H. Gibson, to do a test, and this was also on the Elter-Vienna connection line, just to prove the connection wasn't through D. Elter's mother, and he matched even more with Courtney, 645, and again, I'm still hoping that it's first cousin once removed. We then come to the Khazanov Boys School Register. As I mentioned earlier, there are very few records surviving for Khazanov, so I didn't know how I was going to piece the tree together. I contacted a museum in the town and asked them if they had any records that might help with family research. And they said they actually had several registers for the Bull Boys School in Khazanov. There were no surviving girls registers, but there were boys registers. So I asked if they could send me anything for Elter or Ulrich to see what I could find. And they sent me several Word documents, and I extracted from them all of the records I thought were of interest. And here we have them. And you'll have to memorize some of these because they're going to come again later. We seem to have a son, Joseph Elter, born 13 December 1891, parents Judah and Brucha. And if you remember, that's the same parents of the bride in Vienna, Judah and Brucha. And then we have David Elter, born in 1894. His parents, again, Judah and Brucha. And here you'll see that Judah is described here as Groner, which is one of the surnames from the Stashever tree. Sometimes Judah is called Ulrich, sometimes called Groner. And here we have Brucha Elter. Then we have Gronem Elter, born 1897, son of Judah Groner or Ulrich and Brucha Elter. And finally, we have Getzel Elter, just one record for him, born 4th of May 1901, only a father given, Judah Ulrich. So at this point, I'm not 100% sure if this is the same family, but probably. But you can see here we have 4 sons of the same couple. And I'm thinking that one of these 4 sons is very likely the biological father of Courtney. Other information I found online, I found from Breslau, a 1930 synagogue list. Very hard to read, it's a bit poor quality, but living on Antony Strasse at number 11, we actually have a Getzel Ulrich Elter living with Bertha Ulrich Elter. Actually, it says Elster, I think there's an extra S there by mistake. The date of birth of Getzel is 4th of May 1901. This is the same boy who appears in the school register. And this is his mother, Bertha, or Brucha. And living in the same building, we have Dora Ulrich, married to Samuel Blaczynski. And this is a daughter of the same couple. I then began to piece together this tree, which I apologize, you won't be able to read this, but you'll see a close-up version later. And I began to use a tool called WATO, which stands for What Are the Odds? And this is a useful tool when you're using DNA. you do tests, you find people who are matching, you try to research their trees, and you piece together the trees, hoping that you can link these DNA matches together. So I began to find DNA matches, and I gradually began to link all of the DNA matches together, not knowing where Courtney fitted in, but I knew how all the DNA matches were connected. And you then ask Watto, what are the odds, to hypothesize where could the missing person lie on this tree based on the amount of DNA shared by all of the people on the tree. And it presents hypotheses, and it gives you probabilities, and you're hoping that one of the probabilities is so large to all the other ones that that's likely the connection. So I'm going to zoom in now on the tree of Judah Lieb Ulrich and his wife Brucha, because this seems to be where all the really strong DNA matches are. And I'll go through this one by one to go through exactly what I found, even larger so you can read it a little better. So we have the son Joseph. Two of his sons died in the Holocaust, but some survived and went to Israel. David Elter has a very high score under Watto. We have nothing about him apart from the school record. Hendla Elter was the one who went to Vienna and has the children the grandchildren in Israel. Gershon Elter went to Israel and has survivors. Getzel, we know nothing about at this stage, but a very high score for being the father. Samuel Elter was one of the few birth records I found, but he was born and died in 1902. Dobra was the daughter we found in the 1930 synagogue list. And then Watto suggests there's always a possibility of another child that you might not know about, but it's at a higher generation and very unlikely. And I'm now going to go into even more detail. So at the top here, we have the children and the families of Joseph. I contacted several family members in Israel. I have a great contact in Israel who manages to locate people, whether they want to be located or not. And I tried to talk them into doing DNA tests, and it was a really difficult situation. Very few of the children were actually happy to talk to us. They weren't willing to take DNA tests. A couple of the grandsons eventually, after about 6 months, said, well, okay, we might do the DNA test, but how much will you pay us? So we didn't go any further with them. We thought that was a bit ridiculous. So we tested Zed Elter at the top. He finally agreed after about 6 months, and he matched this amount, which is a reasonable amount. This is 349 centimorgans, and again, it's yet another first cousin once removed probable, because there are very few other relationships which are one generation out. I am believing that Courtney lies in this column here, which is where all of the other ones born in 1920s, 1930s lie. So it's a good relationship. I also tested Zed Elter's Y DNA, and I'm not sure if you can see this, but his Y chromosome matched Courtney 37 out of 37. It was a perfect match. So I no longer have any doubts about the Ulrich-Elter connection. Zed Elter and Courtney definitely had a common male ancestor. The next person I found was R. Brzezinski. Actually, she found me, or rather her son, D. Kalmbach in Switzerland found me. He had just taken a test. It was a very close match to Courtney. It turned out that he was a grandson, of Amalia Elter, daughter of Joseph, and his mother was still living, I think it was Innsbruck. I put R. Brzezinski in touch with Zed Elter in Israel. They are first cousins who'd lost touch many, many, many years ago. And when Zed Elter discovered this and was in touch with his cousin again, he was absolutely over the moon. He was delighted and wondered why he'd taken so long, 6 months, to agree to take the test. He would have found his long-lost cousin much faster if he'd agreed faster. And he was so happy, he actually sent a photograph to Courtney and family of all his grandchildren and wished them happy Passover. I think he referred to Courtney as uncle, which isn't quite strictly true, but it was still nice to get that message and the photograph. I then moved on to Gershon's family. These were the children, the boys, E and A Elter were the ones who refused to take the test unless we paid them. So I went down onto the daughters, thinking they would be more amenable. And here we have a connection up here. which is a very good connection. I actually can't read that number because of the way that this is being shown. 531 centimorgans. 89% chance it's a first cousin once removed based on a 1 generation difference. But there's a small possibility, 8%, that it's a half uncle, half niece. So we can't rule it out quite yet. You never know with DNA because it's passed on randomly. It could always be one of these smaller percentages. We then tested a elder sister, just in case. And it was 90% possibility of first cousin once removed, but there was still a very small chance, 6%, that it's a half niece, half uncle. So we still can't rule it out. We then moved up to the other branch of the family, to V. elter. This was quite interesting, that the families obviously don't keep in great touch with each other. None of the families in Israel had heard anything about David or Getzel. They knew nothing, which I thought was a bit of a surprise. A. elter and D. elter thought their cousin V still lived in Israel, but she'd moved to America 30 years ago. It just shows you how often they were in touch with each other. So we sent the DNA test kit to Israel and then had to send it on to America. V. elter didn't match that highly. She was only 358 centimorgans, but in actual fact, it was great because it's still first cousin once removed. And because of the small amount of DNA, the possibility of half niece, half uncle disappears. It's simply not possible. So we can now rule that relationship out, and it has to be first cousin once removed. So it looks like we're not looking for the Joseph branch. We're not looking for Handel's branch, because obviously she's a woman and we're looking for a father. And we're not looking for Gershon's branch. So we have to be looking for David or Getzel. And unfortunately, the family in Israel don't know anything about them. And there was nothing on Yad Vashem for David or Getzel or their families, or for them submitting pages of testimony. So we had a bit of a brick wall, and it took 2 years in total to solve this. It wasn't 2 years continuous research. We'd keep taking breaks as we hit brick walls. I was working quite closely with Courtney's son, Mark, and Mark was continually Googling on the internet to try and find more information. And he hit gold in the spring of this year when he found data on a Czech Holocaust website, which hadn't been there the previous year. And it was something we think had probably been uploaded in October or November of 2022. So what is this on a Czech Holocaust website? There were 25 documents, very poor scans. I actually asked them if they could send me better scans and never got a response. But they had information for an elder Getzel Ulreich, born 4th of May 1901. That is the same date of birth as our Getzel Ulreich or Getzel elder in the Khazanov Boys School Register. We had lots of pages here, including a photograph of him. And what does this tell us? Well, they've obviously mangled the name slightly. His name was Getzel, and his two surnames were Ulreich and Elter. He was born 4th of May 1901 in Khazanov. So this is definitely our man. He was living in Prague. His parents were Judah Ulreich and Berta Elterova, Berta Elter, correct. And he was married to a woman called Jenny Deutsch. And here we have a photograph and even a thumbprint. According to this, his wife was born 1903 and she was murdered in the Holocaust. But not only that, he had a son called Kurt. Now, is this just a coincidence that this man has named another son called Kurt in 1937, and he also died in the Holocaust? Very strange to see that name. Now, I'm just going to summarize here what the other pages on this Czech website said. So it appears that on the 3rd of August 1933, which is around the time Kurt was conceived, or Courtney was conceived, Getzel Ulreich Elter applied for a German provisional passport from the Beuthen police. And on the 11th of November, he flew to Czechoslovakia, where he applied for a residence permit. By 1937, he'd met and married, and we're not quite sure where or when exactly, another Jewish woman called Jenny Deutsch. And in 1937, they had a son, Kurt. Very strange. In November 38, he was arrested and threatened with expulsion because he didn't have a valid passport or a visa, and he declared he was a social democrat and it was unsafe to return to Beuthen. In March 39, he applied for a passport, and in 1940, he applied and was successful in getting a visa to go to Shanghai, but the family never went. In July 42, Getzel, Jenny, and their young son Kurt were transported from Prague to Theresienstadt and then to Baronovici camp in Belarus, and they were murdered there on the 28th of July, 1942. So Getzel was one of our two main possible culprits, if you like, but sadly, there was no way we were ever going to find any family members to do DNA tests or anything else. Now, here is another one of the documents in the collection. This originally had a very dark red background, and together with the very poor quality of the scan, it was extremely difficult to read, but with a bit of photoshopping, I converted the red background to orange, which made it a little more legible. I decided to look at this on Courtney's 89th birthday because I decided we really couldn't let the brick wall stand. There had to be some clues that I'd missed. And so on his 89th birthday, I began to look at this and spotted a clue. Here we have information saying that Getzel's parents were Judah Ulreich and Berta Elterova from Galicia. It says here he's married to Jenny Deutsch, and says he has a son, Kurt Deutsch. Now that's actually interesting that the son is given the surname Deutsch. That suggests that this was also a Galician marriage, and that's why the boy was given the mother's surname. But this is the interesting bit here. It actually says siblings, but in fact it only lists brothers. And it lists brothers Edward, Gustav, and Joseph. But who on earth is Edward? We've seen the school register, and we've seen the trees we've built up. We know that Gustav was Gershon, that was a name he used. We know Joseph was Joseph, but who was Edward? We don't know an Edward, but we do know a David or a David. Could Edward be David? So I began to research, not for a David Elter or a David Ulreich, but I began to search for Edward Ulreich. And I found an Edward Ulreich born around 1894 in several trees online, many of them in the UK. And I found an Edward Ulreich in the 1939 United Kingdom Register. And if you look here, here is Edward Ulreich, and look at his date of birth, 9th of April, 1894. And that's the exact date of birth from the school register. This is definitely the correct man, but he's now calling himself Edward rather than David. And he's married to a woman called Agnes, and he has a son called Jack. And we also have, I don't know if you've ever used the 1939 register, there are two redacted entries, which will mean that these people are people who could still be alive, and therefore, because they're not known to be deceased, they have been erased from the record temporarily until you can prove otherwise. Now, I began to research Edward and Agnes. I discovered they only had two children. They had a young daughter who died very, very young, so she shouldn't be listed here. She died long before this. And I was actually quite excited when I found Edward here. I was hoping that we were going to find some living descendants, living relatives of Courtney. But sadly, Jack Ulreich was in the RAF during the war, and his plane crashed into the North Sea and he perished. So Edward and Agnes ended up with no living descendants. I contacted the National Archives to ask them, I know that these two other records at the bottom are closed, but could you tell me anything about this? Just a surname. I don't want to know who they are. I don't want dates. I don't want full names, but even a surname would help. And they said, no, we can't possibly give you that information because we don't know if they're deceased. I then looked up, well, I'll come back to that later. I looked up the UK 1921 census for Edward and Agnes, and I found them here. And we have Edward Ulreich married to Aggie. And if you look at where Edward Ulreich was born, he was born in Chrzanów. So again, just confirmation that we definitely have the right man. We've got the right date of birth. We've got the right town in Galicia. Surely this must be David Ulreich. Looking at the London Gazette, I found information about Jack Ulreich, the pilot officer in the RAF, and how he'd perished in March 1943. And you will see at one point on the death, on the will or the grant, it references his father Edward. I also searched the Gazette and discovered that David Ulreich, known as Edward Ulreich, this is good, was naturalized in the UK in 1931. So there'll be interesting papers there to look at. Now, I didn't know at this stage why I couldn't find this earlier. I'd searched the National Archives database looking for naturalizations, and I hadn't found this entry because it was actually miscatalogued, and the catalogue's now been updated and corrected, but it was actually under the wrong name on their catalogue. We even found a photograph of Edward. So here's Edward. So this is Courtney's uncle. David Ulreich, known as Edward Ulreich, naturalized in 1931. I found his naturalization certificate. And here we see David Ulreich, known as Edward Ulreich, born in Chrzanów, date of birth matches the school records. Parents Judah Ulreich, Austrian, and Brucha Ulreich, Polish. So everything ties up beautifully. And I'm not sure if any of you have ever worked with naturalizations from the United Kingdom, but the certificate is the last item that is produced when someone applies and is approved. What you really want to look at are the background Home Office supplementary papers, because they give all of the background, including police reports leading up to the naturalization. I've actually ordered copies of the background papers, which are 74 pages long in places. Sometimes you get a dozen pages, sometimes 20, and I've had 74. So I tried to see if I could order the papers. The papers were marked as closed. So I put in a Freedom of Information request, knowing this man was no longer alive. Could we have them open? And the opening was granted. And a few weeks later, they were granted. And I managed to obtain copies of the background papers. Meantime, returning to the 1939 register, I started to do more research on Edward and Agnes. And I discovered a will of Agnes in the late 1950s. And I was interested to see who she left the money to or anything else she had. There's Agnes. She died in Liverpool, and she left everything to Jean Dorothy Elter and her daughters Anne Belinda Elter and Jacqueline Suzanne Elter. Who are they? Well, Jean Dorothy Elter was Ferdinand Elter's wife. This is the family of D. Elter, the dentist in Israel. He hadn't been born yet, so he's not mentioned. So I then thought, I wonder if the two redacted entries in 1939 may be Ferdinand and his sister from Vienna, who may have come before the war to London and be staying with the family. So I located Ferdinand's death certificate, and I also realized that Helene Elter had just passed her 100th birthday, which meant that the 1939 register could be opened. So I contacted the National Archives. They wanted £25 a shot to open the records. I wasn't willing to pay that, so I went through via Find My Past, who will do it for nothing if you supply the information. And they opened the records. And here indeed we see that the two redacted entries are Ferdinand Elter and his sister Helene Elter, the two children from Vienna. It turns out that they left, I think, in 1938. It wasn't exactly a kinder transport. They were actually sponsored by Edward Ulreich, who arranged for them to come to the UK. I also found Edward Ulreich's gravestone, which confirmed that his Hebrew name was David. And there were very interesting things in the naturalization papers, including this from a special branch police report, which says, I beg to report on a Polish passport number blah, 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 issued to the applicant in London on 5th June 30. He is described as David Ulreich, Rechte Elter, known as Edward Ulreich. And the next bit is the interesting bit, because it's confirmation of what I mentioned earlier about the names on Galician records. I'm informed by the Polish Consul General the addition of Rechte Elter to the applicant's name merely signify his mother's name was Elter and his parents were married only according to Jewish rites and not in accordance with the Austrian marriage laws. So confirmation of what most of us already knew about Galician research, which is that the parents did not have a civil Austro-Hungarian marriage registered, the children were deemed illegitimate and used the mother's surname. But here was an absolutely beautiful piece of the supplementary papers, and I think I can make them even bigger, a little blurred. It actually gives the names of all of David's or Edward's siblings. And it says he has a brother, Joseph, 37, married, fruit merchant in Byton. Gustav, a brother, 33, married, fruit merchant. And Getzel, a brother, 26, married, fruit merchant, both in Hindenburg, Germany. Hannah Elter, that's actually Hendla in Vienna, 27. Also a sister Dora, we saw her in the synagogue register. Placzynski, 22, and she's living in Breslau. And we also find out that David has been living in the UK for 18 years. He arrived in the UK in June 1912. It also told us in the papers that David only returned to see his mother in Brighton once in the time he was in the UK. He went there for just a couple of weeks and returned. So if he was back in the UK and never returned again, there is no way David could be Courtney's father. And so we are left with only one brother, which is Getzel, who must be Courtney's father. I also found in the Imperial War Museum, doing various Googles, an audio recording by Ferdinand Elter made in 1997. And it was going to talk about his life in Vienna and something about his family. And I thought this would be very interesting to obtain. It wasn't available online. And when I contacted one of the directors of the Imperial War Museum, I discovered the entire collection of audio recordings had been sent off to be digitized. And it will soon be digitized. And if you come back in 2 or 3 years, you'll be able to find it. So I said that wasn't ideal, given that we were dealing with this Holocaust survivor. Could you do something faster? And they said, okay, they will try and do that one first. And it's taken months. And just this week, I obtained the copy of the recording. It only took about 5 months. I don't know if you can hear that or not. Can you?
No, Michael.
No?
No.
Okay. Sorry, but it was only a very, very small piece which confirmed it was Ferdinand talking about his parents and mentioning the fact that they were cousins and that his mother was really an Ulreich. I forgot when I shared screen to share for sound, but it's only a small section. I've actually listened to it, as have the family, and there's really nothing of great importance in terms of linking to Courtney, but it was just nice to hear a first cousin's voice and to hear a bit about the family and their life in Vienna.
We believe you, Michael.
It's available online now if you were to acquire it. Just Google it. I'd just like to compare now a couple of photographs. We have here a photograph of Kurt. We have a photograph of Getzel Ulreich, and the family do believe there are some resemblances, hairline, etc., which suggests that they could be father and son. In April of this year, I was lucky enough to meet with Courtney and some of his family at an AJR, the Association of Jewish Refugees conference in London. And that's really the end of my story. So using DNA and a bit of traditional genealogical research and a bit of sweat and blood at times, we got there after 2 years. And I'll stop sharing screen now.
Wonderful.
All right. To Paul and Michael, that was just riveting. I felt like I was in the middle of a movie watching like a whodunit. And I think for all of us that have done a lot of research, we know that quite often the story is made up of multiple bits and pieces from multiple locations and repositories. And this was a great example of the jigsaw puzzle that for so much of us is genealogy. So on behalf of the Society and everyone online, thank you both very much for a wonderful presentation. And I think in terms of the naming of the presentation for Lionel Sharpe, it gave him honour too. That was something that he would have enjoyed immensely.